participated in our first round of outreach associated with this review of our soil classification system. We thank you very much for joining us here today. We already had 2 previous meetings. If any of you had received invitations to those meetings and are attending today, there are going to be quite a bit of similarities between those 2 meetings. So if you might think twice about joining, or stick with it and ask some different questions this time around. But I'm just going to turn it over to Hunter and his team. And again, thank you so much for participating.
Thanks, Katya, and aloha, everyone. My name is Hunter Hevelin. I'm a food and agricultural systems planner. My firm, Supersistence, has taken on this contract with the state in our investigation of soil classification systems and their use in regulating agricultural lands. Joining me today are a number of team members and teammates across this project from G70. We have Barbara and Ryan. We have Dr. Bruce Plash of Plash Econ Pacific, Azan Iwashida, Dr. Azan Iwashida, as well as Hannah Hubanks, I believe I saw in the participant list, from Cardno and Stantec. So really a broad base of social scientists, soil scientists, planners, agricultural economists pulled together to really support this effort over the previous 12 months or so. And without further ado, maybe Barb, if you could cue up the slides and we'll get going. So, as I said, this effort is really about soil classification systems and their use in regulating agricultural lands. This effort was initiated and funded by the state legislature through Act 189 in 2022. And over the course of the day, we're going to provide a bit of a project update, talk about how we went through the development of some of the recommendations we're reviewing, going through those recommendations themselves, some of the details embedded in the model update that we're proposing, and then have an opportunity for discussion. Depending on how many of you stay awake or stay participating over the course of this, we may just do a Q&A by chat, or if we've winnowed too far, we may just have a sort of popcorn questions. So we do hope you'll stay with us. As a project update, so we'll start off with the timeline for the past, gosh, I guess it must be 12 months now. We've initiated this effort, back in July of 2023. So we'll go through that timeline, some of the systems we reviewed, the policies we reviewed, the initial outreach and interim report, and some of the other subsequent research. So in terms of that timeline, kicked off July 2023, had sort of a preliminary research phase that was followed up by initial public outreach and interim report. And now we're in the phase of producing additional recommendations and reviewing those. Subsequent to this round of outreach, we'll be producing some final recommendations that will be consolidated into a final report that goes to the legislature in time for the 2025 session. So the research to date, and these are aspects that are really addressed in the interim report, but we reviewed some of the existing soil classification systems that are applied in agricultural land regulation, namely the Land Study Bureau, or LSB, efforts, the agricultural lands of importance to the state of Hawaii, land evaluation and site assessment, and as it was written in, I believe, the bill and some aspect of the RFP, we were asked to review the SURGO database, which is the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Services Soil Survey Geographic Database. And so we, through feedback from our steering committee, some of which I believe are with us today, as well as with feedback from our team and the Office of Planning, developed a list of criteria. And this is really just sort of a visualization of some of what we viewed as being some of the strengths and weaknesses across these different systems. It's important to clarify that in this review, the SURGO database was really reviewed as a database itself, not as a land evaluation system, but more as a compilation of soil survey data, which I'll touch later on about where else data included within SURGO may actually be applied for land evaluation. So we did this kind of deep dive into all these systems. There's 100 some odd pages you can go find at the legislature's website or on the project website to dig deeper in. But we also really looked at the classification systems application in state and county codes, as well as administrative rules. So within that body of, we could say, regulations, we found 40 different references that either spoke explicitly or somewhat indirectly to the application of one of these systems. And so we can see the distribution, right? The majority of them, about half, are really at the state level, followed decreasingly, interestingly, as we go across the state, from Hawaii County, Maui County, Honolulu, and Kauai. Next slide. So when we looked at the system by jurisdiction, we can see that the Land Study Bureau, for a specific reference to a system, was the one that was most applied, right? So 16 different references to Land Study Bureau classification systems across all these jurisdictions statewide, followed by agricultural lands of importance to the state of Hawaii. And you'll notice LISA, the Land Evaluation and Site Assessment, really not getting a whole lot of utility in our policy, which to some degree makes sense. While the LISA study was completed, it was never formally adopted by the legislature, and thus really actually only appears in administrative rules in a couple of places. You will, however, notice that the unspecific references, that this is the largest number, where there is a variety of sites in policy around the state that speak to a soil classification system, but do not specify which should actually be utilized. So we see that as an opportunity to be addressed in some of our recommendations, which I'll touch on later. Next, we can see how by focus area that the vast majority of these references were really about district and zoning definitions, followed by, a distinct application in agricultural dedications or other types of land use controls or environmental reporting. Beyond these, we also found through our public outreach, we used a web tool called Polis as part of our discussions that allowed participants to submit their own comments and then state whether they agreed or disagreed or just skipped a given comment from another participant. We had a wide variety of comments come in, and this is sort of what we found to be the majority results, namely that the systems should be focused on protecting, or at least having the protection of prime agricultural lands be a factor, that the system should be incorporating soils into land use decisions. And we can also see at that bottom one that there was a majority disagreement with the notion that the LSB system is fine because soils don't change over time. So really sort of pushing to the notion that LSB, that the labile nature or the changing nature of soil and the necessity maybe to address some of the shortcomings in the Land Study Bureau. Next, we compiled all that into an interim report, went to the legislature in time for the 2024 session, and continued on from there to do some best practices research, which will be included in our next report. But part of this was really looking at a short list of jurisdictions, not just across the country, but also somewhat internationally, that then with some feedback from the steering committee and the State Office of Planning, we shortened to 3 distinct jurisdictions for review, namely California, Maryland, and New York. Some of the original impetus and interest there was in California, the application of soil classification in multiple regulatory programs, as well as some of their integration of digital and readily updatable models. In Maryland, there was interest in part because of some of a cognate history of a plantation landscape of land consolidation, as well as a similar distribution of farm size and count. In New York, some of their spearheading, while also having a very strong history in land evaluation from an economic perspective, integrated into some of their regulatory work. There was also a sort of a novel focus or a recent focus on soil health and carbon assessments, and that was part of the intrigue there. What we found in these best practice researches was namely that through California, the importance of basing these systems on the best and available data and updating them regularly. That we should really view the development of particular land evaluation tools as things that can be stacked to perform multiple purposes, right? So we could have a baseline system that assesses the utility for agricultural value that we could then maybe iterate on to do an assessment for the utility of, say, land for, say, renewable energy development. But we don't necessarily want to have one tool that we believe is going to accomplish all of those roles simultaneously. California also really did a good job of demonstrating the ability of making data and maps available and accessible. In Maryland, we saw the utility of integrating these classification systems into state land protection systems and funding programs, as well as having relationships between different layers of decision-making, namely, say, a county jurisdiction with a state jurisdiction, in terms of addressing disparities in land classification outputs. In New York, we saw utility in the partnering with the university, namely Cornell, that has had a long history with the state, New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, that has helped with updating and keeping up to date land evaluation approaches that have really helped to inform land protection schemes, land valuation schemes over decades. Similarly, through that partnership with the university, this New York State has also provided funding for sustained regular soil classification system updates. And similar to what I was commenting above about stacking these tools, that we can view these classifications as an input to other agricultural land related assessments, but not as a replacement, right? So we should not confuse a renewable energy model or land siting model with a agricultural economic value model, which I would say I think we may have begun to do a bit in the state, right? We have Land Study Bureau applied in a lot of different ways for a lot of different tools. New York also highlighted the importance of carefully selecting crops that are used in productivity analysis, and I'll touch on that a little bit later when we get into the recommendations. So those were our kind of best practices. I'll take a breath there and see if there's any quick comments, and if not, we'll just move forward into the development of our recommendations and then into the recommendations themselves. And I can't see all of you, so put something in the chat or raise your hand. And if not, we'll just move right along. Cool. I see no hands. So in terms of developing these recommendations, really the goal is to provide some actionable guidance to enhance the role of soil classification systems in agricultural land use regulation. Whew. Right, so really looking at the interface of the utility of a land evaluation approach as part of a regulatory regime. So this is really not about developing a land evaluation, or as termed in this study and by the state, as a soil classification system. We're really not focused on renewable energy. We're not focused on, we could say, housing development. We're not even necessarily focused on farmer decision support. This is more about the regulatory interface from a land use, governance, protection, and the various other types of uses that we listed, say, in the assessment of existing policy. So towards that end, we sought to determine which systems, were most appropriate for use, providing some options about whether continued use or revision to existing land evaluation systems make the most sense, trying to incorporate the feedback that we heard from the public outreach, from our steering committee, and from our best practice research, and then really looking to the extent possible, identify some of the requirements for implementing some of these recommendations, right? Are there statutory or rule changes? Are there, orders of magnitude costing that we might want to consider? And really tried to take both that, that preliminary research work, that stakeholder outreach, if you go to the next slide, please, and that best practice research, and we synthesize that initially into, I'm trying to think of, Katya, how we may put this diplomatically, a potentially unhelpful volume of recommendations. I think there were about 40 that I'd initially compiled from a general framework of how we even think about approaching land evaluation, to a baseline kind of soil capability focused system, to iterating on that baseline into multifunctional suitabilities that we were hearing about in our outreach that may have focused on open space value or soil health or cultural value, to a whole section about smart solar siting and potential tax policies and this whole other review. Unsurprisingly, the state and our steering committee had came back to us saying it might be helpful if we could just narrow our focus somewhat. And so we did so, really honing in on what we view as sort of the cornerstone, the first layer of any of these additional analyses, which is to say this soil capability focused land evaluation system. And so this next set of recommendations, while we heard what you said in all the outreach, and we have developed some recommendations related to what we'd heard and what we found in some of that best practice, those will be sort of threaded throughout portions of our final report. But the sort of key pieces that we're lifting up, both in this effort and as our sort of core set of recommendations, are really focused on the soil capability system update as a baseline. So within that classification, we'll get now into the recommendations themselves. So again, to go back to what we'd really heard in the outreach, right? We were hearing that these systems should support producers, inform land use decisions, help protect high quality agricultural lands, really working to address that these existing soil classification systems were outdated or inadequate or didn't necessarily provide sufficient support based off of our current understanding of agricultural lands and land use. Also seeking to try and address some of the challenges, namely data accuracy, integration with modern geospatial tools, as well as accessibility for users. And really want to be explicit about that, the current systems are not really designed to assess lands for renewable energy. They're not really designed to assess lands for non-agricultural development, and are not designed for producer decision support, right? So this is not a farmer-focused tool. And so again, with that in mind, this next set of recommendations, or this initial set of recommendations, we think kind of fits well within those themes and perspectives raised. So we break it up really into two main categories: regulatory and model updates. So the regulatory, four key recommendations are essentially to preserve the Land Study Bureau title, but to update the underlying model in what we were terming, for sake of distinction, as a land and soil capability model. So LSC as a way to differentiate between LSB as the older system. We want to keep the LSB title, but sort of update the model as LSC. The idea being here is that it's a significant lift to imagine changing all of those regulations distributed in jurisdictions across the state from Land Study Bureau to anything else, right? And so it's a bit of a kind of a realpolitik approach on how we may best implement some changes without having to change the actual policy written in to various jurisdictions. Some of what we'd heard in the outreach so far is that, there may be a need to explore how current projects or regulatory decisions, that certain projects may need to be grandfathered in if the results of this new model were to be drastically different than the existing Land Study Bureau model. Second, we'd want to update the outdated classifications in regulations. So this may be the vestigial application of LISA, considering which places we might want to replace ALISH with this LSC, come LSB model. Third being that we should be clarifying the unspecific regulatory references to soil classification systems to be explicit about which system we mean. And ideally, we'd be adopting this LSC type approach statewide as that baseline. So if a reference in our policy is saying, we should be using declare your soil classification as part of your agricultural governance, that we could be explicit and say use the LSB, but really meaning this LSC updated model. And finally, finding the value of exploring a mechanism by which disparities at the parcel level could be addressed. This came up in our public outreach a number of times, as well as something that was found to be really valuable in the dedication processes that Maryland has pursued, right? So a given landowner could, in the instance of Maryland's Agricultural Land Protection Program petition to actually have a different classification so that they would then be eligible for funding for long-term land protection. This is somewhat different than the way that the outreach so far has really highlighted the need to address parcel disparities because of the over application of agricultural of our land evaluation system, namely the LSB, into non-agricultural governance. For example, the use for renewable energy. What we've seen in most of the outreach was that there was a desire not to greater protect the agricultural land, but to use it for what we could view as, say, non-agricultural purposes. So figuring out the mechanism by which these disparities can be lifted up and addressed, and where that process lives, we're going to continue. We hope to hear more from you all on, because it is I think where that process lives, who governs it, will greatly influence the type of decisions that are made as a result. For example, and again, this is just purely conjecture, if that effort were to live, say, at the Land Use Commission or at a renewable energy focused entity, PUC, for example, the decision-making processes would likely be very different than if it were to live at the Legacy Lands Commission, right? Just in terms of what their orientation and their position is in their decision-making. And so while we recognize that a mechanism to address these disparities is needed, we are yet to be too focused on where exactly and how exactly that process should run. So those are the regulatory recommendations. The next set are our model updates. So namely, as said prior, so we want to revise the LSB into a land and soil capability model that uses, our modern methods of land evaluation and modeling tools to enhance the effectiveness and the relevance of the LSB. We want to be making that land and soil capability model updatable and based on the latest data, namely, utilizing Surgo's annual survey refresh, where we get little bits of information, better information about the extent of soils across the state. That should be integrated. Doesn't mean we necessarily need to do the update annually, but we should do the update more than once a century, which is about the pace we're on so far. Our third piece here is that we want to be integrating historical and current land use into this land and soil capability model, particularly with the note informed by our plantation history and research by Hannah Eubanks, Susan Crow, and others, that this intensive cultivation history has significant influences on soil health, which has implications for management. With that being the case, we do not want to just integrate historical management, historical intensity of use as something that may lower solely the classification result, because we do not want to necessarily reward poor management of long-term intensive poor management of lands as reward them by having a lower classification that could lead to greater upzoning and intensities of non-agricultural use. I think I said that clearly enough. I hope so. I'm running out of breath. So finally, the importance of selecting crops strategically for a productivity analysis, and this comes in part from a couple pieces in outreach. So in the outreach, there was often a notion that the Land Study Bureau's work really only focused on the utility of lands for pineapple and sugar, where in actuality, they actually did a review both for, forage crops, forestry, diversified agriculture, sugar, and pine. And so it really was a robust integration, right? It was a pretty diverse capability system, as opposed to being focused on a singular crop's suitability. What we want to make sure to incorporate going forward is that the crops or the agricultural production systems that are considered are diverse enough to address both our current use, the unique crops that we have that we produce here, which I think the Eilish system did a good job of integrating, and some of what has come up in our outreach so far are the importance of taro, coffee, and potentially other crops. The key piece here is that if we are integrating a productivity analysis that could be, part of an economic focused analysis within this land and soil capability model, if we select for the wrong crops, that we do the productivity analysis on, it could skew the types of potential land uses. So one of the things that was seen in, let's see, I believe it was in New York, corn and hay, for example, were used as the crops that integrated into their economic productivity models. And tax rates were then related to the model that was developed. But if you were producing cranberries on a marginal land that could have been very productive, your tax rate may not have been well related to your actual productivity. Or if you had another diversified crop outside of corn and hay, you may have been, saddled with the potential productivity of those crops, even though you weren't actually producing them. So we want to make sure that there's a diversity of crops considered in a productivity analysis, which again, the Land Study Bureau effort did a fairly good job of approaching. So want to take a minute to see if there's any initial questions on some of these, and if not, then I'll dive into a little bit more of some of this model update and the parameters that we view as being important. But I want to take some questions. I'm at least going to take some water.
I got a question. Wondering on the regulations that have an unspecified soil classification reference, are those like just kind of not used at all, or are they being applied and the soil classification is chosen by whoever's making the request, or how are those even operated now if there's no soil classification system referenced?
I cannot say in particular for each of the jurisdictions that has a sort of unspecific reference. In some cases, I think it may just have been part of a reporting process, right? It's sort of like, you're doing an environmental review, just tell us what your soil class is, without necessarily being specific. I think in other cases, there probably is a greater need for decision making. So we, while tasked with compiling all of the existing references, what came out of that was a number of them were vague, but we didn't necessarily have the resources or time to go through and figure out, well, what is actually happening decision making wise going forward. We did ask in the previous couple group meetings. There was a sort of a regulatory expert body that was pulled together to see a little bit more about how things were used, but I don't think anybody got to the specifics of, this system ends up being the de facto one here versus there. Barb, you were in those outreach breakouts. I don't know if you would have any further takes, but.
Sure. Yeah, some of those unspecific regulations did say, productivity analysis, soil classification, some general terms. And when we did have a discussion about it, essentially, say as an applicant, you are going to write down all of those things that you think are appropriate. And then when you submit to the agency, there's a discussion that happens with the agency just to make sure that you have everything listed within your application. And so I think at this point, that's really where it comes to, is it's not necessarily stated within the regulations, but it comes down to having that conversation with the agency to understand exactly what they're looking for.
Great, thank you.
And I believe the database I made of all of these is linked in the interim report. I can verify that, and we can explore putting it on the website as well, or at least linking it to the website. But that would allow you to filter by sort of an unspecific and to see which jurisdictions. It's been 8 months, so I've totally forgotten which they are. But Michelle?
Hey, Hunter. I was intrigued by your mention of this Maryland, I think it was, using soil type for like a dedicated agricultural tax program. Was that, would you say that was like an incentive-based kind of thing to try and get people to stay in agriculture? Or was it more like, the other side of it, sort of a negative
It's
thing?
actually quite different than a circuit breaker tax or an agricultural dedication. Maryland's agricultural land protection program functions. The closest thing I would say we have to it is our legacy lands effort, which has recently started funding more agricultural easement and preservation projects, but historically has not had a large portion of it. And for example, does not actually have in any of their decision-making rubrics, the land classification system is not part of their decision-making.
I see.
In Maryland, their structure functions so that there is a periodic review of sort of which areas should be most protected. That then allows landowners to work with kind of a regional or a county layer of decision making, which then forwards their proposed areas for protection to the state project, which would then release funds for easement purchase. And this project has been exceedingly robust and probably is the national leader in terms of total area of protection relative to the size of the state. And I think is a very strong model for us to consider, particularly for the preservation of smallholder agricultural parcels. And not to say smallholder like 1 or 2 acre, but and they have thresholds that also are set at the state level that are then refined at the county level. So I think it really offers an interesting approach, but is somewhat distinct from the ag dedication process.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Would love to get more info on that if you.
Happy to share on it, and there will be definitely a bit on it in our final report, but I can share some of the other takes as well.
Thank you.
Seeing a couple in the chat. Oh, Jordan Hart, question.
I'm sorry, I'm unable to hear you.
Unable to hear Jordan.
Yes, I'm sorry. Did I totally interrupt and you could hear him just fine?
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
No, still can't hear you. You don't appear to be on mute, but
How about
Tom
now?
did. Oh, there you go. Now we can hear you.
Sorry. So I guess I would be considered one of the people who's concerned that this is going to be a vehicle to justify the development of agricultural lands in the county of Maui. I mean, I suspect the state of Hawaii, but really my focus is the county of Maui. So in that context, you're discussing potentially putting the decision-making authority and potentially the evaluating authority under various different bodies, including the PUC. If that were being done, is there some sort of holistic evaluation of the goals of the state for sustainable food production, like what that means, how we would do that, how much land we need? I know that there's the IAL process is probably didn't unfold as expected by anybody, but it was trying to do some version of that, it seems. So I guess I would be concerned that if there was going to be a system that was created where more land would be essentially like, I don't want to say devalued, because it would be identified as not having what may have previously been thought of as high value for agricultural purposes. So then large tracts of land would be coming out of, have justification to urbanize or go into rural or go away from preservation or intended use of agriculture. Is there some sort of coherent accounting in order to not just result in this rush to use the new system to
As a justification for upzoning.
right, anything that anybody
Yeah.
was afraid to face the land use commission on would
I will say, and I hope I didn't stir fear by anybody who's attending from those groups I referenced or anyone else, but really it was just sort of like trying to offer, right, that there are different entities that have different roles, right? And we are yet to be prescriptive about what that decision-making process is. But I would also like to highlight that for example, in that Maryland example, they have existing criteria about what they do. This is a mechanism where someone can make a case that that could conceivably lead to greater protection was how the Maryland system was set up. The state doesn't have, we have goals around increasing agricultural output, but there is no plan in place, nor do I necessarily see one that tries to relate local consumption with local production. Just because of our political economy, increasing productivity does not decrease household food insecurity, nor does it necessarily mean that it gets routed into our local distribution systems. As it pertains to, a rush on upzoning, I think that in my mind, this type of an update would ideally serve as one tool to help better protect the prime agricultural lands or our quality agricultural lands, which is not just a sort of a personal perspective, but also something that we heard a lot in the outreach, right? So however these recommendations are heeded, I hope that they come with the context within which they've been formed, which is to say that what was shared over the course of our research and our outreach was really a desire to have better protections of quality agricultural lands, not as a mechanism to upzone writ large.
Right.
So-
Yeah. Just to reiterate, I totally understand that. You reiterate the word quality. And so, the flip side of that would be lands that are now identified to be as lower quality and then essentially appropriate for redirection outside of agricultural uses.
So I think again that's where, a careful review of the regulatory approach, right? If we're saying we're going to keep LSB as the title, it doesn't necessarily mean that the rating that a certain system is applied to, that a certain upzone opportunity or non-agricultural use becomes allowed, doesn't mean that should necessarily stay at the same rating, right? So for example, if we were to just rerun the Land Study Bureau model as it exists, as it was developed in the 50s, 60s, the loss of irrigation across the state would probably result, the loss of irrigation infrastructure across the state, and this is something that Dr. Bruce Plash had highlighted to me years ago, that we would probably result in a significant lowering of land quality because of the loss of irrigation infrastructure, and because that was a factor that went into what eventually was the overall productivity rating, ABCDE. So while we want to recognize the reality of our existing infrastructures, the reality of our history of intensive agricultural use, it may mean that we need to rescale, recalibrate that results table from what it maybe once was because of the changes in our land use history, the changes in the history of use, changes in the extent of your infrastructure available.
So let me clarify. Is there going to be an analysis of the relationship to state long-range plans in the context of suggesting a different grading system to be administered by a different body or not?
Is there going, I'm not sure I follow that.
Okay, so what you were just describing was basically the loss of the connection of the irrigation systems from the plantation system, if I can understand what you were generally alluding to, and that those unirrigated lands would be valued in the context of agricultural productivity significantly lower because of the disconnection. If there's a system created to remove those properties from ag land use designation, not ag practice, like not operational use, is there any sort of analysis of how that fits into our plans or what effect that would be? Or is it just
I'll say, and I'll have to move on after this so we can get on to the next slides. One of the other recommendations that we'd incorporated was the value of actually having a tracking of the loss of agricultural lands or the transition of agricultural lands to other uses, namely, I think, energy being a predominant one, and that there are examples of other states that have implemented systems that offer you carrots for developing on lower quality agricultural lands and offer you a stick for developing on higher quality agricultural lands. At this point, our state has not developed a system with a similar robustness for directing where development goes outside of just, here's the threshold within the Land Study Bureau, and after which have at. Of course, you still have to go through your permitting processes and so forth, but there's no community benefits package that gets to be considered, or a different type of tax incentive if it's a E land versus a C land, right, as an example, right? So that is an aspect that we hope to touch on, and was part of our sort of initial long list of reviews.
Real quick,
yeah.
may I just add something? I think it wouldn't be and all of a sudden, here it is, this is the change in land use, live with it. One of the things that came across in our outreach was, why don't we, before there is this update, present the information to the public, have input. So if there is a change in your land value, or not land value, excuse me, the land classification criteria, then that you could have a chance to discuss that and work on it before it actually goes into place. So I want to, we're looking into having those guardrails and safeguards in order for there to be participation. So everything doesn't just turn on its side. I hope that's helpful.
Cool. Thank you all for your questions, and I want to finish going through the rest of our slides so that we have time for some additional questions as we go. So this next set, right, taking these kind of high level recommendations, the next set of pieces we're going to go into really are about how we would go about revising this LSB into a land and soil capability model, right? How do we want to approach having a modern land evaluation system be the baseline of our governance, right? I'm really thinking of that land evaluation requires sort of the matching of ecological and management requirements with relevant land uses and land qualities, while taking sort of ideally the economic and the social conditions into account. And when we look at the history of land evaluation approaches, well, the types of things that get measured have changed over time, right? So this goes back to, we'll say, just keep it at one century prior. The Story Rating Index, which was part of modified for integration into the Land Study Bureau, that was really focused on soil's physical characteristics, right? So the stoniness, the slope, acidity, and the like. And that was really kind of in the 30s, and evolving from there, we got more into things that looked at both the physical characteristics, but also some of the productivity or economic analysis. And some of this work was really spearheaded out of Cornell and integrated for a long time into some of New York State's land evaluation approaches. And I would say that the Land Study Bureau approach also does a good job of really integrating both some of those physical characteristics with some of these productivity pieces. As time went on, we started to see additional considerations come into play that were informed really by the era that they were a part of. So the land capability classification system that's integrated into the USDA SERGO database took some of those kind of productivity related pieces and some of those physical characteristics, but then also started to, you could have two different versions of it, right? So here's the quality if irrigated, here's the quality if not irrigated. So it starts to proliferate in terms of the ways that we can analyze based off of also management. With the advent of the agricultural lands of importance to the state of Hawaii, efforts that were really predominantly informed at the national level with concerns over the loss of key agricultural lands, we started to see how certain non-dominant cropping systems could also be integrated, right? So the important lands through ALISH were really about mechanized production, but ALISH also through the addressing of unique and other lands considered sort of locally specified crops like coffee or taro, et cetera. With the LISA system in the 80s, that really started to consider what were some of the nearby sort of planning relationships and the relationship to markets and other factors that could be considered. And I would argue that the push these days has been more looking at what are some of the off-site effects of management in more complex land evaluation models, as well as some of the, for example, the American Farmland Trust has a land evaluation tool that's called oh gosh, what is it? PVR, productivity, versatility, and resilience, right? And so there starts to be other layers now that are being considered, right? There's ecological outcomes, not just ecosystem services that inform agricultural productivity. And so thinking about that history and reviewing some of the theoretical work on land evaluation, we've developed a list of parameters to help inform what this land and soil capability model could pursue. While we're not tasked in this by the legislature or in this effort to delineate what this model is, what this next model should be, or to fully flesh out the maths of it, we are taking from the recommendations and trying to get a couple steps closer to if this these recommendations are taken up by the legislature and they do want to fund the development of a newer approach, a novel approach, that there's some public input to help inform, as well as research to help inform what the parameters are that should be considered. So I'm going to go through some of these parameters. Some of them we really have viewed as being kind of baked in, and others we used some of the previous outreach in this second round in the past month or so, had discussions rather with folks that have more expertise in land evaluation modeling, as well as the regulatory side, to help inform what of these pieces should be important to pursue. So with that, we'll go through the first set. So really looking at the purpose, right? So part of this is helping to differentiate, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Is the purpose of this about a specified, like a singular suitability for a given crop, or a very specific use, or is it more of a generalized capability? And this is sort of there's some confusion, or interspersing of the use of one term versus another throughout land evaluation theories, as well as throughout this project overall. But what we highlight here is that all of these systems to date, and so you can see the parameter, the description, LSB, LCC is the land capability classification from USDA NRCS that's embedded in the SERGO database, and then ALISH, agricultural lands of importance in the state of Hawaii, LISA, and then LSC being this land and soil capability system, which is essentially like a revised LSB approach. All of these really, I would say, have a capability focus, and thus we think that continuing that really makes the most sense. In terms of the land uses considered, as mentioned prior, there's a variety of different uses that were considered for the Land Study Bureau, and we recommend a similar sort of generalized agriculture that is informed maybe by suitability analysis or productivity analysis of a variety of different other agricultural use types, namely forestry, grazing, forage, orchard, etc. And the other parameters, we're looking at geographic coverage, and these were this initial list that I'm sharing were really the ones that we saw as, I don't want to say they're non-negotiables, but we had certainty around, this is the approach we should be taking. We really viewed, especially because the SERGO database is statewide in Hawaii, that the model itself should be statewide, which is not necessarily the case for some of our previous efforts, right? So the ALISH exempted a bunch of lands. The LSB model, for example, has been sort of amended over years as the agricultural district has changed. We recommend actually implementing a model that applies statewide and continues to have its data shared at a statewide basis, and is not sort of trimmed with the political boundary shifts. In terms of the land evaluation unit, sort of the smallest decision-making layer, all of these really follow or draw from the SERGO database. So the soil map unit within the SERGO database continues to be the land evaluation unit. In terms of a spatial or non-spatial analysis, we really view this as having the importance of considering, a parcel or that land evaluation unit's place within the landscape. And so because of that, and the integration of topography, slope, etc., into a model, we view this as being a spatial approach. Next, in terms of the evaluation being based off of land characteristics, which we could frame as those aspects that are directly measurable. So that again could be something like stoniness or acidity, right? We could see those as land characteristics. Land characteristics differ from land qualities, which may be sort of built off of a land characteristic. So we could say the suitability for intensive agricultural production with machinery could be built off of the characteristic of stoniness or slope, but that land quality of sort of machine tillability, machine friability is really a derived value. And so we view, instead of focusing solely on those directly measurable characteristics, which is something that early work did, the 1930s, the Story Rating Index was really about directly measurable characteristics, that we think that this land qualities are important to consider. This next piece, the single versus multi-area suitability, we do have the mathematical capacities these days to really have complex modeling of how the use or decisions, activities on one parcel or one land evaluation unit impact the neighboring one. We think that type of modeling is probably not necessary for the regulatory purpose. That's more of an outcome-driven assessment. And none of our regulatory systems seem as focused on that as, at least in my appraisal, as well as it would probably add significant costs and complexity to the management of a model overall, which could have impacts on its ability to attain and retain funding. So next slide. So again, these were sort of the assumptions that we saw as being built in, that the purpose was on capability, that we're seeking an assessment for generalized agricultural land use, statewide modeling with soil map units, and the use of land qualities in a spatial analysis that focuses on single areas. The next set we had some questions on, and that we had discussions in the previous second round of outreach, so in the past month or so. And really these are looking at whether we're regarding the underlying characteristics, if you will, as being static or dynamic. And in my perspective, part of the reason that we want to affirm that the land, soil characteristics, while maybe slow variables in many instances, do in fact change, is that by affirming that these are dynamic characteristics, it affirms that the model itself, namely that the suitability built off of those characteristics itself should also be dynamic, and thus we must continue to update or rerun the model with our most recent data. The importance of embedding and affirming these in our perspective, and I will say that in the outreach we've done in the past month, that the notion that we regard these as dynamic was I would say affirmed by those who participated, is that it reinforces the idea that this should not just be a model that is, we run an analysis, we put it on the shelf, we put it in a GIS database, and we use it for land regulation for another 80 years, right? Because in practice, that's effectively what's happened with our Land Study Bureau effort, right? Soils data was collected in the 1930s, that was then released in the 1950s, that then got turned into a model in the 1960s and 70s, that now dictates whether or not you can build a solar farm in nearly the 2030s, right? So we're making decisions off of, in some cases, data that is nearly a century old, that has drastic impacts on our agricultural landscapes, on our energy landscapes, and so forth. But by embedding into the parameters themselves the notion that our land characteristics and thus our suitability is dynamic, we hope to reinforce the notion that this model is something that is alive, that the data will continue to change, and that we view this as something that needs to be updated with some frequency. Doesn't necessarily need to be annually, but it needs to be, something that doesn't just live on a shelf. In terms of the homogeneous versus compound land utilization, so we could be, instead of regarding a single land use type like grazing, we want to be considering multiple or compound factors, right? So this could be grazing, it could be forestry, it could be orchard production, it could be diversified vegetable production, and that we're sort of considering all of these, not just a single homogeneous land use type. And again, those dynamic, and compound, based off of the previous outreach this round, were affirmed. where we have some lingering questions, I should say, or at least some, go to the next slide, please. Some kind of remaining pieces. And again, we are not tasked with figuring out all the details of this model within the scope of this project, but we are trying to get towards, notions of where we'd like to go. In terms of the suitability measurement, right? What are we saying there is capability for? We think that the physical constraints, crop yields, conceivably some of the economic factors related to that crop yield or productivity are important, but there's still some oscillation on the extent of other factors that should be incorporated. We've had, on the one hand, a number of perspectives that, focused on environmental quality outcomes, and others that said we should really be eschewing those concerns. So we'll hope for some additional feedback on that. And in terms of the results, right, what is the actual classes that come out of this? The previous LSB system had these 5 capability classes. Lisa was on a scale from 0 to 100. Alish had these 3, prime, unique, and other, and the land capability classification had, 8 different classes. If we are retaining the LSB title, we think it also makes sense somewhat to retain the capability class output, just for some degree of similarity. But in digging into the way that the LSB model was developed, and pointing to our discussion earlier, right, there may need to be a recalibration of what classifies as A. And it may be that the modified story rating index that was used in the LSB model, which had, things like slope and stoniness, acidity, as well as a factor, was it the Y factor, which was for rainfall or whether you had irrigation. And if you had irrigation, you got 100% in that rating. We may need to not say that not having irrigation rates, significantly drops your rating as much as an idea. So those are the other model parameters that we've been having some discussions about. Go to the next slide, please. And with that, where are we at here? Wanted to take questions, hear feedback, hear perspectives on any volume of those parameters in particular. We can move back the slides if folks have one we'd like to pull up, but whether it's on those assumptions or on the other kind of parameter questions, we're interested to hear additional input, because as you can tell, this is not a fully baked set of exactly how this model should be built, but more about honing in on what we think it should, how it should approach its evaluation approach, how it should approach its evaluations, and the facets that inform it. So with that, someone please say something so I can take a breath and drink some water.
I have a question.
Thank you, Tom.
From my perspective, this whole exercise that you're doing, your scope of services, strictly deal with the preservation of ag lands and the reclassification of soils related to that. Is that right or no?
It's not actually explicitly focused on the protection of ag lands. It's on the regulation of ag lands, some of which is focused on protection.
Okay. I've been involved with land use planning and from both the public's perspective and the private development perspective. I work for a large landowner, and we have built a lot of residential homes in different areas. My experience with the public sector goes way back to the early 70s. And so, the Land Study Bureau's study, I thought was fascinating, because if you ever saw and I'm sure everybody's seen the Land Study Bureau maps, it's just simply amazing how somebody went and covered all of the lands and all the specific soil types and the capabilities way back when. And in my experience with public sector planning, we use that a lot in helping farmers and helping land use decisions. But the reason I asked you that question earlier is because if there's no correlation to allowing development per se, even if it's classified A or B, then who uses this? Who benefits from the results of your study? Farmers, ranchers only?
Well, I would say, I mean, as tasked, we were seeking to understand the application of the existing systems in our regulatory structures and to explore the extent to which they are sufficient to pursue those regulatory tasks. And I would say, I think because of that, and with the feedback that we got in outreach, there was a notion that the existing systems were not necessarily up to date or providing sufficient data, or maybe even necessarily being applied in a way that was felt to be sufficient. So I don't necessarily see this. I don't really view this primarily as a farmer decision support tool, right? This is not something that is designed to assist a producer in determining what they could grow on their land. What it may help inform a producer is if you're choosing between two parcels, maybe there's an that a higher rating could tell you that it's generally, maybe better for generalized agricultural use, but that's different than a targeted sort of suitability analysis for your particular production system. The primary application of this type of an update, in my perspective, is in the regulatory realm, right? And that's what we were tasked with. And so that's the primary user base, in my perspective, are those who are in the role of some type of agricultural land governance. And that may be in protection, it may be in determining upzoning or dedication or other types of regulatory management.
But in Hawaii, is there a structure for regulators to do exactly that, to regulate types of uses, agricultural uses, on these particular pieces of land that you're evaluating?
I don't know that there's so much I guess I would say, I don't think of this as informing the master use table that may happen at a county level, for example, in terms of zoning. I think it is more, so it's not so much about the agricultural uses, it's about the potential agricultural use and how our perspectives on that potential influence whether we protect, preserve, allow alternate uses to happen concomitantly, or allow agricultural lands, to shift their district or zoning designation because of our perspective about their potential value.
What kind of zoning designation are you talking about?
I would think mostly the agricultural zones, or agricultural district.
Yeah, okay. So to my way of thinking, agriculture is agriculture. It doesn't matter what you're proposing to grow or produce. If say a corporate farmer came in and wanted to do, like you say, strawberries or blueberries or whatever it is, would anybody in the state tell this corporation, no, you can't do that because your soil type isn't appropriate or not the right type? Is that, am I don't know.
No, I don't see this being applied in that way at all. And there is nobody in the state. There's no regulatory mechanism that would allow for that, as far as I'm aware. Right? It's not delineating what a producer does on their land. It's framing what the generalized producer community may want to do into a sense of a potential that then informs how we utilize that land, how we protect that land, how we develop that land. So it's not, I don't see this ever being applied in you said you wanted to grow corn, but our analysis says, it's better for beans. Thus, you're rejected. There's no mechanism by which anybody has to, you have to submit a farm plan for an agricultural dedication and conceivably for a housing development or for your farm dwelling, but those aren't, in my understanding,
Yeah.
generally reviewed with a fine tooth comb, let alone even necessarily an agricultural expertise, depending on which county you're operating in. But I want to provide an opportunity for some others to put some questions in as well, Tom.
Okay. Okay,
But feel free to put some more in the chat, and definitely happy to follow up as well. But I just wanted to, we only got about 20 minutes left, so. Others have some takes, questions, perspectives? Amy, I see your hand up.
Sure, Amy Koch. I'm with the USDA NRCS. We are the authority that published the Surgo data that Hunter discussed. And great job, Hunter, of trying to explain what this study is about and what you've been tasked with. And it's huge, and you've done a great job. But just one kind of more clarification, perhaps, that you kind of already gotten to, but just the need to kind of have a distinction between the science, which is the capability of what a particular land can produce, and the policy, which decides how that land will be used. Whether it's, so if it's zoned ag, but we have lots of that, things that are zoned ag that are then determined to be changed to some other use by the Land Use Commission, by local policies and other ways. And so having a distinction between those two, so you have a tool that is something that's been updated, and that can be something that can be utilized to inform those who are making those policy decisions with something that they can be confident of, that it's not something that's like, completely outdated. And, having a way to, understand how those changes have come about, because there's many areas that are, if you look at the LSB, or zoned prime agricultural land, that are now very much urban areas because of development. And just having that distinction between the two, and having this system inform to the best of its ability to be utilized for land use decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? Is that
Yeah.
there is the analytical that goes into the model itself, but the
Yes.
application really varies based off of the who
Yes.
that regulating body is, what they're tasked with. But part of what we hope to highlight in the parameters that we've lifted up, as well as just in the framing overall, right, is that the purpose of this is about, it is not about determining where to put your solar panel. It is not about where determining, where to put your house, or where housing should be developed. It is not even necessarily about determining, and to Tom's question, right, it is not even about telling you where you should grow which crop.
Correct.
It is not a farmer decision support tool. It is not a renewable energy siting tool. It is about the sort of the compilation of best available knowledge into an understanding of agricultural value for the production of and this is maybe an unhelpful shorthand, but in the way I think about it sometimes, the widest variety of things over the longest period of time with the least environmental degradation.
And an inventory is another word that comes to mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reggie, I see your hand up.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Thanks for taking my question. You may have covered this already, but my question was, if you could just remind me where like the inputs would be coming from. Is it at the state or county level, or which agency is going to be, because you're looking at a more dynamic, updated system. Who's going to be inputting into this system?
So, I mean, that comes in part, right? So there was work done, I can't remember which California department, that essentially took this story rating index, which is a 1930s era product, characteristics based model, and took that and related those facets to the Surgo database that comes out from NRCS. And essentially, instead of having a hand calculation, which is how it was done then, said we can make a parameter model, probably built in ArcGIS, but it could be in any geospatial or geospatial modeling approach, and in their instance, whenever the new data came out from the USDA, they could just click run and it would rerun the model. So in terms of where the spectrum of data is coming from, we are not delineating, where all the best way to get that that might be. I think certainly for the soils data, it would be from the USDA and RCS, but in terms of productivity, that's that remains to be a good question, because we do not have the same level of enumerators that we could potentially draw on, or data that's been collected. When the soils data was originally collected in the 1930s, there was a sort of a gradient of the collection done. So some areas got, every periodic distance, there would be an actual soil sample taken. In other areas, that distance got longer and longer. And then in some areas, they just went and talked to land managers, ranchers, and producers that said, how's this parcel? Good? No? Yeah, cool. All right, great. And that information, right? Those notions from land managers in the 1930s is now embedded through the LSB in our regulatory structure now. So not even necessarily a soil sample being taken is currently what we are deciding our land use governance on for agriculture. So while it seems unlikely to me that we are going to redo an entire land study bureau type effort for a decade, be nice, great, but it seems unlikely to me. Thus what we need to hopefully do by defining these parameters, and some of the discussions we had in the previous outreach, you were there in this past month, right, is identifying what are these data sets that exist, that could exist, that could help inform these different parameters. And a number of them, I think, are met by the Surgo database. Others, land use histories, could be, just the previous plantation maps. In terms of productivity, we have crop suitability models. I ran one as part of my efforts at UH a few years back. So there's tools out there that we can draw from. And conceivably, we'll have some volume of those maybe listed as part of our appendix. I'm assigning myself greater work for this final report, so I just strike that from the record. But I can see Katya already excited to read more. But I think we have, those of us that are in the modeling have some sense of where that could be, but we're not tasked with actually finishing the model, building the whole model. So it may be where we already know something, we'll note it. Kikipua.
Aloha kako, mahalo for inviting us to provide our mana'o and to listen and understand where you are. We just learned of this process. I'm not sure how my name got put on this list, but no one has talked to us on Lanai. So it would be good to understand the data sets that you are using on Lanai. Many of the data sets are outdated. We have done, through our Kuahivia Kai, our watershed project, done a lot of work, privately funded, and those data sets may be of interest, vegetation coverage, all those great fun stuff. So the model is only good as the input, as you all know. And so we would love to be part of the conversation. So I welcome you to contact us and so that we can be part of this conversation. So thank you for inviting me to this presentation, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I will highlight, the Surgo database is statewide. That one I mentioned that originally in the 30s, when they did the collection, some volume of the land coverage was just asking a land manager their perspective on it, in some cases were huge swaths. The most recent major overhaul of the Surgo database was done, and Amy, correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe in the early 80s. And that kind of broad data collection effort for soil science overall is kind of, I don't want to say fallen out of favor, but I will say Hawaii is lucky in that we actually have statewide coverage, because not all states even have full Surgo coverage. However, we do have a legislator in the Federal Agricultural Committee who may be interested to put in on our behalf or pursue funding to update that baseline data as a possibility, right? So that was another kind of piece that came out in some of our outreach, was if Joe Tokuda could advocate, if we viewed that as being important, right? The data is 50 years old in many cases, and again, not all these variables change so drastically, but we do know that there's been a fair amount of shift in land management in many parts of the state since that time. Amy?
Yeah, just that's mostly true for what you said as far as how the Serco. The most recent major update was for Hawaii Island. That was what we called an extensive revision, going back to those areas that Hunter talked about, because in the early days it was, is it pineapple or sugar? Okay, we're going to do very detailed. Is it watershed? Is it swampy? Is it steep? Okay, maybe not so much. We went back through it with a very different lens, being, that it was, we use our land differently. After that was published in 2012, our program has changed, but we are updating things on an annual basis. For example, 2018 in Puna, post lava flows, that has been updated to show the impacts of that area of the lava flows that were so devastating to many of our farmlands and residential areas. We do have funding, we have staff that are doing updates, but it's on a smaller basis. So what Hunter said is in part true. And of course, as a federal employee, we don't do any kind of lobbying or asking for things, but we do have our own budget that we are working on, but there are always opportunities to expand. And if there is a need identified and a priority, because this system wants to be based on our data, then that can perhaps be something that can be elevated and worked out.
And part of it could be as well, if we view that the timeline for that kind of an overhaul may be beyond the horizon of this effort maintaining its currency. There are also approaches that have been done elsewhere. I believe it was Iraq or Iran, like they took essentially 70s soil mapping data and took some more recent collections and had some kind of management overlays, and then we're essentially able to kind of create a more modern map based off of partial recent data and extensive historical data. And so there, things like that could also be pursued, to Reggie's question. Others have questions, perspectives, want to share? We got about 8 minutes left before the rest of Wednesday happens. Not seeing any other hands up. Wow. That means everybody understood everything. Which is always a treat. Well, I think if we don't have any further questions, we can maybe call it a day. Get some Wednesday afternoon back.
I just wanted to ask Brian, could you go ahead and put the link to the website one more time in the chat? And if you do have additional questions, you can email us at hisoils, HISOILS @g70.design if you have questions. There'll also be a survey after this closes out, and we would appreciate any feedback that you'd like to add there. And then you can always go ahead and look at the website for additional information and take a look at that interim report, as well as some of the other background information that has brought us to where we are today. Thank you.
Yeah, and with that, mahalo for your participation, your mana'o. Don't hesitate to reach out if you've got additional ahas that emerge subsequently. And again, we've got a few more minutes of folks, something does come up and you want to raise your hand or chime in, please do. And
there were many important issues that came up during this project, and as you said earlier, Hunter, I think that we are going to try to capture them in the report itself. There were questions regarding energy and housing and, you know, the various competing needs that we have here in the state. And you were right and continue to be correct to try to really focus on the soil system itself and the degree to which the soil system is current, accurate, does everything that we need for it to be, such that the decisions that we make are correct. You know, we definitely understand that there are, you know, there's a larger context and many things go into decision making. But this study was really very narrowly focused. But it seems as a result of these conversations that we really do need to have some broader conversations. And I think that that's in part what we'll, you know, end up having to recommend to the legislature. You know, there was so much interest in this subject matter, which went beyond the subject matter to land use issues in general, that, you know, that's part of what came out of these discussions. And we'll try to capture that to the best that we can in the final report, right, Hunter?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hunter,
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I have one more question.
Sure.
You showed the retaining of the different productivity ratings from A to E in this study, the productivity ratings for the soil types.
Yeah, so that was along with the recommendation of keeping the Land Study Bureau title.
Yeah, yeah.
We recommend, just because of, you know, we're doing so to have some, it's not necessarily regulatory continuity, but to avoid having to reclassify, you know, change the policy, change what's in statute in many cases to something else. And because of that, keeping the results classification approach of A through E, we think also probably makes the most sense. Because if we say we're going to keep it at Land Study Bureau, but then Land Study Bureau now is on a scale of 0 to 100, that means you still got to change some volume of those policies, some volume of those statutes.
Yeah. Okay. My question is related to some what a gentleman earlier brought up, like because the irrigation systems in the state have been eroded or not in place anymore, some of the classifications could possibly change. So is your study, will your study consider that?
I would say that in our appraisal, right? So we're keeping the name, we're keeping the output, but
Right.
the whole interior portion, like the model, we view as really as being overhauled to consider things that LSB did not consider originally, to integrate kind of modern modeling approaches that could be updated and rerun easily. And so I think it will really, and a part of this discussion, I think, is help to inform, right? We don't want to just rerun Land Study Bureau with new data. We need to rethink about, really think about what the weighting systems, the outputs are, so that we have something that is robust and reflective of the what we heard, particularly in outreach, right? That this is an important tool for the protection of quality agricultural lands, right? And so for that, you know, we're not tasked with this effort, and it has been a struggle as someone who does suitability modeling and modeling work. Like, it has been a struggle to resist the urge to, you know, figure out what those parameters all should be and so forth. So really what this phase is trying to inform that next step by delineating, like, well, we know we're going to keep that title. We think we should keep that A through E, but we also know that because of the changes in irrigation infrastructure extent, because of the updates in soil quality data, that there may be significant fluctuations, and we need to have steps in that modeling work to really understand, well, what are what are the volumes of changes, and how might we need to recalibrate into that A through E output, so that we have something that pursues the goals that have been articulated by our outreach so far.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think I said that right. Close enough. I hope. All right. Well, barring other questions, want to just really express mahalo to everybody for taking this time out of your day. And for many of the names I see on here, taking time out of many days to participate in these efforts, in this outreach. So it's been an honor, a privilege, for myself, and I think I can speak on behalf of my team to pursue this effort on behalf of our state and our agriculture and our collective futures. So really hope that you are all as excited to read a long report to the legislature come December or January as I am to write it. But we may end up doing some other briefings once we kind of finalize a little bit more about some of these based off of the feedback that we've heard today, and hopefully other feedback you may share with us going forward. But barring that, mahalo nui loa, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. Thank you, Katya. Thank you, Barb.
Mahalo.